Hi everyone, my name is Jody Brandon. Welcome to Kids Discovering History. Today we are going to learn all about the Revolutionary War. This was a war that was fought over 200 years ago between Great Britain and the people they governed over here in America. You see, America was not always a free and democratic nation. Back when we declared our independence, our country was made up of 13 colonies that were controlled by the British government, which was known as Parliament, and their ruler, who was called King George III. After many years of being under British rule, the colonists decided that they should be allowed to govern themselves, and soon they set in motion a series of events that led to the American Revolution and eventually their freedom.
Great Britain had been settling the colonies in America since 1607. By the early 1700s, there were 13 colonies under British rule. They were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. In 1754, the French and Indian War began in North America. It was waged between the armies of Britain and France. The war lasted 9 long years, but with the help of American colonists, Britain was victorious and gained control of all of Canada. Unfortunately, the war proved quite costly, and Britain was heavily in debt. The British Parliament proposed that a new source of revenue lay in taxing the people of the American colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first direct tax ever imposed on the American colonies. It was applied to newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The colonists were denied a representative voice in Parliament and were outraged by the Stamp Act. They believed that taxation without representation was tyranny. In protest of the tax, they refused to buy British-made goods and even petitioned King George III to repeal the act. The new law became quite difficult to enforce, so in 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. But at the same time, Parliament asserted their power by passing the Declaratory Act, which gave them the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. They imposed taxes on glass, paper, and tea. Anti-British sentiment was growing, especially in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. The following year, the House of Representatives of Massachusetts Bay sent out a circular letter which urged the other colonies to become united in their protest against the Townshend Acts. In retaliation, Parliament ordered the royal governors of the colonies to dissolve any assembly that approved the letter. The Virginia House of Burgesses was dissolved after they passed resolutions which declared that they, and not Parliament, had the right to levy taxes on their colony. The Townshend Acts, like the Stamp Act, proved unenforceable and were soon repealed. Parliament, however, left the tax on tea to show its authority over the colonies. Parliament also sent 2 regiments of British soldiers to Boston to quell the anti-British sentiment. They were constantly met with jeers and disaffection from the Bostonians. On March 5, 1770, a crowd formed around the local customs house and began to taunt the lone sentry at his post. Feeling threatened, he called for assistance. 8 more soldiers arrived on the scene. Without a direct order, the soldiers fired into the crowd. When the gunsmoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead. Word spread of the Boston Massacre throughout the colonies, and hatred for the British grew even stronger. In 1772, Samuel Adams of Massachusetts created a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other colonies. The following year, the Virginia House of Burgesses, under the leadership of Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, did the same. In May of 1773, Parliament passed the British Tea Act. This gave a virtual monopoly to the British East India Company to sell their tea in the colonies. In November, the company's tea ships arrived in Boston's harbor. The local dock workers, however, refused to unload the cargo. The local British governor issued a deadline for the colonists to pay the tax on the tea, whether it was unloaded or not. The date was set for December 16th at midnight. When December 16th arrived, Bostonians gathered at the Old South Church to discuss the issue at hand. They devised a plan that was sure to get Britain's attention. Under the cover of darkness, Bostonians disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded the tea ships. They went on to dump every last chest of tea into the harbor.
This event became known as the Boston Tea Party and dealt a mighty blow to the authority of the British government.
In response, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known also as the Intolerable Acts. Under this law, the port of Boston was closed, and the colony of Massachusetts was placed under military control. The other colonies were outraged and rallied together to show their support for Massachusetts. In the fall of 1774, delegates from the colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. Notable members included John Adams and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, and Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and George Washington of Virginia. The Congress condemned the Intolerable Acts, approved the arming of local militias, and agreed on boycotting all British-made goods. After being in session for almost 2 months, the Congress adjourned and agreed to redress any unresolved grievances the following spring. In March of 1775, a Virginia convention was held in the old St. John's Church in the city of Richmond. Believing that war with Britain was inevitable, Patrick Henry urged his fellow Virginians to take up arms. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. On the night of April 18, 1775, 700 British soldiers under the leadership of General Thomas Gage were sent to Massachusetts to destroy the arms and ammunition that colonists had gathered in the town of Concord and to capture Patriot leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock in the town of Lexington. Upon learning the news, a silversmith named Paul Revere rode on horseback through the dead of night to warn his fellow colonists that the British were coming. The following morning, on April 19th, 70 volunteer militiamen arrived in Lexington to face the British.
These volunteers were known as Minutemen because they swore to be ready to fight at a moment's notice.
An American captain named John Parker issued this command to his men: "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." British Major John Pitcairn ordered the Minutemen to lay down their muskets and disperse. They refused. Then all of a sudden, a shot was fired. By what side, it was not known. But the Battle of Lexington had begun, and the shot heard round the world was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. When the battle was finally over, 8 Americans were dead and 10 were wounded. The British soldiers, who were known as redcoats because of the color of their uniforms, marched on towards Concord. While the British searched the town for arms and ammunitions, militiamen gathered near the Old North Bridge in Concord and exchanged gunfire with the redcoats. Fighting continued as the British made their way to Boston. By the end of the day, British casualties numbered 73 dead and 174 wounded. The Americans, on the other hand, lost only 49 men, with 41 more wounded. The city of Boston would remain under siege for almost a year. In May of 1775, a Vermont farmer named Ethan Allen led a regiment known as the Green Mountain Boys to Fort Ticonderoga near Lake Champlain on the New York-Vermont border. Before they reached this British-held fort, they were joined by another American patriot named Benedict Arnold. On the morning of May 10th, they stormed the fort, surprising the British soldiers who were still sleeping. The British cannons at Fort Ticonderoga were transported to Boston to aid the militia in their fight against the Redcoats. That very same day, the Second Continental Congress convened at the Philadelphia State House. John Hancock was elected president of the Congress. Military matters were the first order of the day, and the members took steps to provide a Continental Army and to select a commander-in-chief. John Adams, recognizing the need to unify the colonies, recommended George Washington of Virginia for the position. Washington was highly regarded for his military service during the French and Indian War. By choosing a Virginian, the Congress believed the southern colonies would support the war that was, at that point anyway, taking place in the north. On June 15th, by unanimous vote, George Washington was elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. On June 20th, he received his commission and immediately set out for Boston. With the city of Boston under siege, Patriot soldiers planned to gain control of the surrounding hills on the Charleston Peninsula in order to fire upon the British forces below them. On June 16th, 3 regiments of American soldiers were led up Breed's Hill by Colonel William Prescott. The following day, General Thomas Gage sent 2,500 British troops under the command of Major General William Howe to attack the American position. The first 2 British attacks were fought off, but a third penetrated the American lines. The Patriots, running out of ammunition, retreated to nearby Bunker Hill. Although all of the fighting had occurred at Breed's Hill, the battle is known today as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British had won, but suffered heavier losses than the Americans. When news of the courageous Patriots reached the other colonies, support for the war increased greatly. In October of 1775, the British Parliament replaced General Gage with General Howe as commander of the British forces. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army, his troops numbered between 13,000 and 17,000 men. Washington immediately began to train them for the battles that lay ahead. In the fall of 1775, Congress approved an invasion of Canada. Canada had been ruled by the British since the French and Indian War, and the country was used as a launching pad for incoming British troops. By November, the city of Montreal was captured by American troops under the command of General Richard Montgomery. The following month, he was joined by a second force under the command of Benedict Arnold and attacked Quebec City. The Battle of Quebec was a failure for the Americans, who were clearly outnumbered. General Montgomery was killed in the fighting, and many soldiers were taken prisoner. The remaining troops retreated back to the safety of New England. In January of 1776, a 47-page pamphlet entitled Common Sense began to circulate among the colonies. Its author, Thomas Paine, called for the immediate declaration of independence from Britain. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. O receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. By June, more than 100,000 copies would be sold throughout the colonies. As spring approached in 1776, the cannons that were taken from Fort Ticonderoga finally arrived in Boston. General Washington, who had positioned his troops at Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston from the south, put the captured British cannons in place, ready for battle. Realizing their inferior military position, General Howe and his British troops evacuated the city of Boston and set sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Washington had won, but he was smart enough to know that the British would be back, and in greater numbers. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia presented this resolution to the Continental Congress: that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. John Adams of Massachusetts seconded the motion, and the Congress began to debate the issue at hand. Since some of the colonies were still unsure about declaring independence from Britain, the delegates postponed voting on the issue until July 1st. The delegates believed that a vote for independence must be unanimous. In the meantime, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft an official declaration. The members of this committee were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. The other members of the committee believed that Jefferson was the one best suited to draft such a historic document. He was reluctant at first, but with some helpful prodding from John Adams, Jefferson soon took pen to paper and created what he called an expression of the American mind. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. After the committee made some minor changes to the document, the Declaration was presented to the Continental Congress on June 28th for final approval. In the early summer of 1776, General Howe and his reinforced British Army arrived back in the colonies. With a large fleet of warships and some 32,000 soldiers, including 8,000 German mercenaries known as Hessians, General Howe set his sights on New York. General Washington, anticipating this move, sent 19,000 men to defend Long Island. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence was passed in the Continental Congress. The date was July 2nd, and John Adams believed that this day would be the one on which we celebrated our independence. On July 3rd, discussion began on Jefferson's declaration. After the Congress made some minor changes, the historic document was signed on July 4th, 1776. This would be the day that America's independence from Britain would be celebrated. The Congress ordered the document to be printed and that copies of the Declaration be sent to all of the colonies. On July 8th, independence was proclaimed in Philadelphia. The following day, it was declared in New York, and a statue of King George III was torn down. Celebrations were held everywhere. In the eyes of the Congress, they were British colonies no more. Instead, they declared that they were the United States of America. Although America had declared its independence, it was still at war, and until they defeated Great Britain, America would never truly be free. The Battle of Long Island occurred on August 27, 1776. British forces attacked Washington's army and inflicted heavy casualties. More than 1,000 Americans lost their lives. Washington led his remaining troops across the East River into Manhattan. British forces pushed Washington's army northward and defeated them once again at the Battle of White Plains. Washington now took his men southward into New Jersey. General Howe suspended his pursuit of the Continental Army and claimed Manhattan Island for Britain.
Did you know that even after the Declaration of Independence was signed, only about 1/3 of all Americans wanted to break free from Britain? 1/3 were still loyal to the British Crown, while another third were undecided. The American colonists who were still faithful to Britain were either called Loyalists or Tories.
By the fall of 1776, New York City was controlled by the British. Loyalists who sided with the British helped in the capture and imprisonment of patriots who still lived in the city. On September 21st, a fire broke out and quickly spread throughout New York. No one knew how the blaze began, but many believed it was started by Patriot spies. New York City would remain under British control for the remainder of the war. General Howe had ordered another general named Lord Charles Cornwallis to continue his pursuit of the Continental Army. He eventually forced Washington to retreat across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The Continental Army was on the verge of total defeat. The men were badly clothed and underfed. General Washington knew that he needed a victory, and quickly. On Christmas night, Washington led his troops back across the Delaware River into New Jersey. At dawn on December 26th, he led a surprise attack against the Hessian and British forces at Trenton and captured over 900 prisoners. On January 3rd, 1777, he attacked the British once again at the Battle of Princeton. Both battles were tremendous victories for Washington and the Continental Army. The British retreated to New York and left New Jersey in control of the Americans. By September, British General John Burgoyne had marched his troops from Canada into northern New York. Along the way, they had defeated the Americans at Fort Ticonderoga, but suffered heavy losses at the Battle of Bennington in the Vermont Territory. With only 6,500 men at his disposal, Burgoyne had to fight a number of battles against a superior American army near Saratoga, New York. On October 17th, he was forced to surrender his remaining troops to American General Horatio Gates. With only 11,000 remaining in the Continental Army, Washington and his troops sought shelter for the winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a cruel winter for the men. With a shortage of medical supplies, many of them died of typhus, smallpox, and other diseases. In February of 1778, a Prussian army officer named Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and began to train the beleaguered troops. He turned the American soldiers, now numbering only 4,000 men, into a formidable force. It was also in February of 1778 that France officially recognized the United States as a new independent nation and threw her support behind the Americans in their fight for freedom. The last major battle to take place in the northern colonies occurred at Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, in June of 1778. American General Charles Lee led his men against the British in combat. At one point, he ordered a retreat of his men, but an angry General Washington rode in on horseback to take over his command. The Battle of Monmouth was the longest battle of the war, and only when the sun went down did the fighting finally come to a standstill. Great Britain had always been known for its superior navy, but in the later years of the war, that superiority would be seriously challenged. Scottish-born Captain John Paul Jones commanded the American ship called the Bonhomme Richard. On September 23, 1779, Jones engaged the British warship Serapis in the English Channel. For many hours, the two vessels exchanged cannon fire with one another, inflicting heavy damage. To settle the score, Jones rammed his ship into the Serapis, and both crews engaged in hand-to-hand combat. When the British captain called on Jones to surrender, he exclaimed, "I have not yet begun to fight." Finally, after 3.5 hours of fighting, the captain and crew of the Serapis surrendered. The Bonhomme Richard began to sink from the damage inflicted on it, so Jones and his crew abandoned the ship and boarded the newly claimed Serapis. It was a monumental victory for the Americans, and John Paul Jones went down in history as a true legend of the sea. Back in the southern colonies, the Americans would suffer their greatest defeat of the war in May of 1780. 5,000 American soldiers were captured in the Battle of Charleston, as well as numerous ships, weapons, and supplies. The year 1780 would also see Benedict Arnold become a traitor to the nation he had fought so bravely for in the past. He secretly gave plans of the important American post at West Point to a British officer named Major John Andre. In return, he was promised a high military position in the British Army. Fortunately for the Americans, Andre was captured by American troops before he could give the plans to his superiors. Benedict Arnold escaped to a British warship in the Hudson River. The name Benedict Arnold has since become synonymous with anyone who is considered a traitor. In the spring of 1781, the American commander of the Southern forces, General Nathaniel Greene, and his army moved against General Cornwallis's forces at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The battle ended in a draw. General Cornwallis withdrew his men and moved north into Virginia. He positioned his men at Yorktown, which was on a peninsula in the Chesapeake Bay. Back in the north, General Washington's army had been fortified with the arrival of 6,000 French troops. When he received word of General Cornwallis's position at Yorktown, he acted quickly. A French fleet of warships was sent to Chesapeake Bay and arrived on August 30th. They were able to drive off the British fleet and now blocked the only escape for Cornwallis's army. On October 6, 1781, General George Washington and 16,000 American and French troops laid siege to Yorktown. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 19th, General Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender his army unconditionally to General Washington. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. Small skirmishes would continue to break out, but the British government was now ready to accept the idea of a free and independent America. The Treaty of Paris, which was signed on September 3, 1783, officially marked the end of the Revolutionary War. On December 4, 1783, General Washington took leave of his officers in New York City. On December 23rd, he officially resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief to the Continental Congress and left public life to return to his quiet home at Mount Vernon in Virginia. Less than 6 years later, his country would call on his leadership once again, as George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States of America.
Well, kids, I hope you all enjoyed learning about how our country won its independence. Many brave soldiers sacrificed their lives so that we can enjoy the many freedoms we have today in this great country we call the United States of America. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all again for another Kids Discovering History presentation.